In 1994, Hollywood was a grand theater of hypocrisy. While A-list stars pinned red ribbons to their $1,000 tuxedos, winning Oscars for pretending to die of AIDS, a real dying actor just miles away was kicked to the curb like a stray dog. Tom Villard had committed the one unforgivable sin in Tinseltown. He dared to tell the truth. They loved tragedy on the screen, but they were repulsed by it in real life. Tom believed honesty would be his shield. Instead, it became a death warrant, coldly signed by the very Hollywood family he adored. A legacy of laughter traded for a lonely grave. That was the brutal price of innocence among a pack of tuxedo-clad wolves. Tom Villard was born in Waipahu, Hawaii in 1953, but his sensibilities were forged in the frosty, practical environment of Spencerport, New York, a suburb of Rochester. This geographical duality, the tropical birth and the Rust Belt upbringing, seemed to mirror the duality of his later persona, a sunny, approachable exterior masking a complex, often chilly internal reality. Friends and family from his early years recall a young man who didn't quite fit the mold of the typical 1970s American teenager. While his peers were interested in the post-Vietnam counterculture or the burgeoning rock scene, Villard was obsessed with the mechanics of performance. He didn't just want to be famous, he wanted to be good. This is a crucial distinction that separates Villard from the pretty boy actors who flooded Los Angeles in the late 70s. Villard knew he wasn't a leading man in the traditional sense. He didn't have the jawline of a Robert Redford or the grit of a Harrison Ford. He had a face that was pliable, slightly off-kilter, and immensely expressive. He realized early on that his currency wasn't sex appeal, but character. He enrolled at the Lee Strasberg Theater and Film Institute in New York. For those unfamiliar with the pedigree, Strasberg is not a place for casual hobbyists. It is the temple of the method, the home of intense psychological excavation, the training ground of Al Pacino, Dustin Hoffman, and James Dean. Villard spent his formative years not learning how to deliver a punchline, but learning how to access deep emotional reservoirs. He was trained to find the truth in a moment, even if that moment was a slapstick comedy scene. This training is the hidden engine of his career. When you watch his sitcom appearances today, look closely. Even when the script is thin, even when the jokes are dated, Villard is never phoning it in. He is fully committed. He treats a throwaway line in a sitcom with the same respect he would treat a monologue in Hamlet. This intensity, wrapped in a goofy package, was what eventually caught the eye of casting directors on the West Coast. Tom arrived in Hollywood at the precise moment the industry was looking for a new kind of man. The 1970s had been the decade of the anti-hero, gritty, dark, and cynical. The 1980s, under the Reagan administration, swung the pendulum back toward the domestic, the safe, and the family-oriented. Television networks were desperate for content that felt wholesome. They needed actors who could play the funny best friend, the harmless neighbor, the guy who wouldn't steal your girlfriend, but would help you move your sofa. Tom Villard walked into audition rooms and embodied this archetype perfectly. His breakout role came in 1983 with the NBC sitcom We Got It Made. The premise was a classic 80s contrivance. Two bachelors hire a beautiful housekeeper, and hilarity ensues. Villard played Jay Bostwick, the more neurotic and high-strung of the two leads. Critically, the show was mauled. Reviewers called it fluff, derivative, and silly. But for Tom Villard, it was a triumph. It ran for 2 seasons, a significant lifespan in the ruthless world of network TV. More importantly, it put his face in millions of living rooms every single week. It was during We Got It Made that Villard perfected his signature physical comedy. He had a way of moving that was both clumsy and graceful, a calculated, chaotic energy. He could widen his eyes in a way that telegraphed panic without saying a word. He became the master of the reaction shot. Directors loved him because he was reliable insurance. If a joke fell flat on the page, they could cut to Tom's face and the audience would laugh anyway. Following the cancellation of We Got It Made, Villard entered the phase of his career that cemented his status as a that guy. He became the industry's Swiss Army knife for eccentricity. Between 1985 and 1990, his resume reads like a TV guide directory of the era. He appeared on Taxi, The Golden Girls, Who's the Boss, and Hunter. In The Golden Girls, arguably the most popular sitcom of the time, he held his own against powerhouse actresses like Bea Arthur and Betty White. He didn't shrink in their presence, he amplified the scene, but there was a trap being set, one that Villard was likely aware of, but powerless to stop. He was becoming exclusively known as the soft male. In the rigid gender coding of 1980s Hollywood, you were either the hero or the comic relief. There was very little middle ground. By playing these roles so well, Villard was inadvertently painting himself into a corner. He was viewed as asexual, harmless, and perpetually childlike. This public perception that Tom Villard was a man without a sexuality would become a double-edged sword. In the short term, it protected him. It kept people from asking questions about his private life, but in the long term, it dehumanized him. It made it difficult for the public to see him as a man capable of suffering, of loving, or of dying. In 1986, Villard made a concerted effort to break out of the sitcom ghetto. He was cast in Clint Eastwood's war drama, Heartbreak Ridge. This was a massive departure. Eastwood was the god of American masculinity, and a film set run by him was a notoriously no-nonsense environment. Villard was cast as Profile, a member of the ragtag recon platoon that Eastwood's character has to whip into shape. It was a supporting role, but a crucial one. Villard had to undergo physical training. He had to hold a weapon. He had to look like a Marine, albeit a misfit one. There is a fascinating tension in this film. You have Eastwood, the icon of the old guard, barking orders at Villard, the representative of the new sensitive generation. In many ways, their scenes together are a microcosm of the cultural clash of the 80s. Villard didn't try to out-macho Eastwood. That would have been suicide. Instead, he brought a human vulnerability to the platoon. He played the soldier who was scared, the one who wasn't a natural killer. The film was a box office success, and for a brief moment, it seemed like Villard might make the leap to serious dramatic actor. Reviews noted that he brought heart to a film that was otherwise heavy on gunpowder and testosterone. It proved that his Strasbourg training hadn't been wasted. He could exist in a gritty world and still be compelling. However, destiny and typecasting had one final massive peak in store for him, and it wasn't in a war movie. It was in a film that would define the childhood of an entire generation, My Girl. Released in 1991, My Girl was a cultural phenomenon. It starred Macaulay Culkin, fresh off Home Alone, and Anna Klumsky. It was a story about death, growing up, and the fragility of life. Tom Villard played Justin, the bumbling, sweet-natured creative writing teacher whom Jamie Lee Curtis's character is dating. This role was the apotheosis of everything Villard had been building for decades. Justin was kind, he was non-threatening, he was a little bit oblivious, but he was also genuinely lovable. There is a scene where he interacts with the children that shows Villard's specific genius. He never talked down to kids. He played the character with a sincere, wide-eyed wonder that matched the children he was acting opposite. When My Girl hit the theaters, it made $121 million against a $17 million budget. It was everywhere. And so was Tom. He was interviewed on red carpets. He was recognized in supermarkets. He had achieved the holy grail of the working actor. He was in a classic. At the start of 1992, Tom Villard stood on a summit. He was 38 years old. He had a solid bank account, a recognizable face, and a reputation as a professional, reliable talent. He had successfully navigated the treacherous waters of the industry for 15 years. He had proven he could do comedy, he could do drama, and he could hold his own in a blockbuster. From the outside looking in, his life appeared charmed. The industry trade papers listed him as a talent to watch for the 90s. Agents were pitching him for pilots. The future looked bright, stable, and assured. But history is cruelest when it provides hope just before the fall. While the cameras were flashing at the My Girl premiere, capturing that winning, lopsided smile, a biological clock was already ticking inside him. The innocent era of Tom Villard was about to collide violently with the darkest reality of the 20th century. The safe man was about to become the face of the thing America feared most. The career he had so meticulously built brick by brick, the training, the sitcoms, the war movies, the blockbusters, was about to be tested against a force that cared nothing for box office receipts or Q ratings. Tom Villard spent his entire adult life living in a structure known within the entertainment industry as the glass closet. This is a term that requires unpacking for a modern audience, as it describes a specific suffocating social contract that no longer exists in the same form today. The glass closet is not the same as being closeted in the traditional sense. A closeted person hides their sexuality from everyone, family, friends, perhaps even themselves. A resident of the glass closet, however, is often openly gay in their private life. Their friends know. Their family knows. Their agent knows. The caterer on the film set knows. But, and this is the iron rule, the public must never know. It is a life of performative silence. You are allowed to be gay as long as you are effectively invisible. You can have a partner, but you cannot bring him to the premiere. You can go to gay bars, but you must enter through the back door. You exist in a state of suspended animation, where your identity is tolerated only as long as it remains a rumor, never a fact. By the mid-1980s, as his fame grew, Tom's life had bifurcated into two distinct realities. Reality A, the public persona. In interviews, Tom was the eternal bachelor. Magazines would ask him about his ideal woman. They would link him with female co-stars in harmless, manufactured gossip columns. Tom played the game. He didn't lie outright if he could help it. He deflected. He used humor. When asked about romance, he would make a self-deprecating joke about being too busy or too clumsy to date. He mastered the art of saying nothing while appearing to say everything. Reality B, the private life. In the Hollywood Hills, away from the flashbulbs, Tom was building a life of domestic stability that would have bored the tabloids to tears. He was not a party animal. He was not frequenting the underground bathhouses that were the focus of so much moral panic at the time. Tom was in a committed long-term relationship with Scott Chambliss. Scott was not an actor. He was a production designer, a man who built worlds behind the scenes. This dynamic worked. They were a creative power couple within their own circle. They hosted dinner parties. They worried about their mortgage. They argued about whose turn it was to walk the dog. They were, in every meaningful sense, married. This relationship is the emotional anchor of Tom's story. In a town famous for 72-hour marriages and transactional affairs, Tom and Scott had something real. Scott was Tom's sounding board, his critic, and his sanctuary. When Tom came home exhausted from playing the high-energy goofball on set, It was Scott who saw the quiet, thoughtful man underneath. The existence of Scott Chambliss is vital to debunking the narrative that would later try to consume Tom. When the AIDS story broke, the media reflexively tried to paint Tom as a tragic victim of a hedonistic lifestyle. The truth was far more mundane and far more poignant. Tom was a monogamous man who loved his partner deeply. He was a family man in a world that refused to recognize his family as valid. But while Tom and Scott were building their domestic sanctuary, a darkness was gathering on the horizon. It is difficult to convey to a modern audience the sheer visceral terror that the word AIDS invoked in the 1980s. Today, HIV is a manageable chronic condition. In 1985, it was a death sentence. But it was more than just a medical diagnosis. It was a moral indictment. The Reagan administration's refusal to acknowledge the crisis had created a vacuum of information that was filled by hysteria. The virus was dubbed the gay plague. Religious leaders called it God's punishment. In Hollywood, it was the ultimate career killer. If an actor was rumored to have cancer, the industry rallied around them with sympathy. If an actor was rumored to have AIDS, they became radioactive. Scripts stopped arriving. Phones stopped ringing. People literally, physically recoiled. Tom watched this happen to friends. He saw talented men, makeup artists, costumers, fellow actors simply vanish. One day they were there, coughing a little too much, looking a little too thin. The next day they were gone, their absences explained away with euphemisms like pneumonia or exhaustion. Tom lived with a sword of Damocles hanging over his head every single day. Every swollen gland, every night sweat, every unexplained fatigue induced a panic that had to be swallowed and hidden. He had to go to work, smile for the cameras, and pretend he wasn't terrified that he might be next. The exact date of Tom's HIV diagnosis is a private detail, lost to history, but we know that by the late 80s the virus was in his system. Receiving an HIV-positive diagnosis in that era was a traumatic event of the highest order. There were no effective treatments. AZT, the only drug available, was toxic and often ineffective. The doctor was essentially handing you a calendar and telling you to count the days. For Tom, the diagnosis brought a new, agonizing layer to his double life. Now, he wasn't just hiding his sexuality. He was hiding his mortality. He had to become a master of disguise. If he lost weight, he had to claim he was getting in shape for a role. If he was exhausted, he had to blame the grueling shooting schedule. He could never, ever let his guard down. To show weakness was to invite scrutiny. To invite scrutiny was to risk everything he and Scott had built. There is a profound cruelty in this. At the moment a human being needs support the most, when they are facing a terminal illness, Tom was forced to isolate himself further. He couldn't join support groups for fear of being recognized. He couldn't speak to the press. He had to suffer in a vacuum of silence. It is important here to address a specific aspect of the stigma Tom faced. The media narrative of the 80s and early 90s was obsessed with the idea of the innocent victim versus the guilty sinner. Innocent victims were children who got HIV from blood transfusions. They were treated with compassion. Guilty sinners were gay men. They were seen as having brought it upon themselves through lifestyle choices. Tom Villard fell into the category that society deemed expendable, but the reality of his life defied the stereotype. He was not the predatory homosexual of conservative nightmares. He was not reckless. He was not a danger to his co-stars. In fact, the irony of Tom's life is that he was the embodiment of the safe values Hollywood preached. He was loyal. He was hardworking. He was kind. He was faithful. He possessed all the virtues of the characters he played on TV. The only difference was the gender of the person he loved. Yet he knew that if the truth came out, none of that would matter. The nuance of his life would be flattened by the steamroller of panic. He would just be another AIDS case. As the 90s dawned and his career hit its peak with My Girl, the pressure became unbearable. Tom was achieving the success he had always dreamed of, but he was doing it while his body was beginning to revolt. Imagine the psychological stamina required to film a scene where you are playing a happy, carefree character, while privately you are checking your body for lesions in the trailer mirror. Imagine the strength it takes to laugh on cue when you are running a fever. Tom Villard wasn't just acting on screen. He was acting for his life 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. He was performing health. He was performing heteronormativity. He was performing future. But biology is relentless. You can lie to the press, you can lie to your agent, but you cannot lie to a virus. By 1992, the walls of the glass closet were beginning to crack. The physical symptoms were becoming harder to hide. The whispers on set were getting louder. Tom stood at a precipice. He had two choices. Option one, continue the lie, retreat, fade away, pretend to retire, and die in secret, keeping his legacy clean. This was the path chosen by Rock Hudson and countless others. It was the safe path. Option two, shatter the glass, step out, tell the truth. Tom Villard, the man who played the fool, was about to do something incredibly serious. He was about to make a decision that would test the soul of Hollywood. And as we will see, he was about to discover that the industry he loved did not love him back. By late 1992, the war Tom Villard was waging in the shadows began to breach the surface. The human body is a fortress, but HIV is a saboteur that dismantles the walls from the inside out. For years, Tom had managed to suppress the visible evidence of his condition. He had relied on adrenaline, youth, and sheer willpower to maintain the facade of the healthy, energetic comic actor. But biology is indifferent to career aspirations. The turning point did not come with a press release or a scandal. It came in the mirror. It started with a spot, a small purplish lesion, unassuming at first, perhaps easily mistaken for a bruise or a patch of rough skin. But Tom knew what it was. Anyone living in the gay community in the early 1990s knew exactly what it was. It was Kaposi's sarcoma. In the hierarchy of symptoms, weight loss, night sweats, pneumonia, KS was the most feared because it was the most visible. It was the scarlet letter of the epidemic. It was a cancer of the blood vessels that manifested as dark, violet, or red lesions on the skin. For an accountant or a librarian, a KS lesion was a tragedy. For an actor, specifically an actor whose career was built on his expressive face, it was a professional death sentence. Cruelly, the lesions did not appear on Tom's chest or back, where they could be easily concealed by wardrobe. They began to appear on his face. Specifically, they clustered around his nose and ears. This development presented an immediate existential crisis. Tom's face was his fortune. It was a face known for its elasticity, its rubbery charm, its ability to contort into expressions of shock and joy that defined his comedy. Now that canvas was being marked by the unmistakable ink of the virus. The standard operating procedure in Hollywood for such a situation was aggressive denial and concealment. The industry had a playbook for this. Rock Hudson had kept his secrets until he collapsed. Anthony Perkins worked through his illness by fiercely guarding his privacy, using makeup and lighting to hide the toll the disease was taking. Tom's management team, his agents, and his few confidants in the industry gave him the only advice that made sense in the cold logic of Hollywood: hide it. Wear heavier foundation, they said. We can ask the lighting directors to use softer filters. Tell them it's a skin condition. Tell them it's sun damage. Tell them anything but the truth. The logic was sound. If Tom could just cover the spots, he could keep the insurance companies at bay. He could keep the casting directors from crossing his name off the list. He could buy time. But then, Tom Villard did something that baffled the cynics and terrified his friends. He refused to hide. Whether this decision was born of exhaustion, the sheer mental fatigue of living a double life, or a profound sense of integrity, Tom decided he was done with the heavy pancake makeup. He was done with the shadows. He looked at the lesions on his face, the purple marks that the world viewed as stamps of shame, and he reframed them. In private conversations and later in his public statements, he referred to the KS lesions as his red ribbon. The Red Ribbon Project had launched in 1991 as a symbol of solidarity for people living with HIV/AIDS. Celebrities pinned elegant little silk loops to their tuxedos at the Oscars. It was a safe, sanitized way to show you cared. Tom's reappropriation of this symbol was radical. He was saying, "You wear a ribbon of silk on your lapel. I wear the reality of the disease on my skin. Why should I be ashamed of my battle while you are praised for your empathy?" It was a moment of profound psychological reclamation. He was attempting to take the weapon out of the enemy's hand. If he wasn't ashamed of the spots, then, in his mind, they couldn't be used to hurt him. This brings us to the central tragedy of Tom's character, his fatal innocence. Tom Villard operated under a delusion that was common among artists who loved their craft too much. He believed that Hollywood was a family. He believed that after 15 years of service, after saving scenes with his improv, after showing up on time every day, after being the nice guy on every set, he had built up a reservoir of goodwill. He genuinely thought that if he was honest, the industry would respect him for it. He imagined a scenario where producers would say, "Tom is fighting a brave battle. He's talented. As long as he can say his lines, we will support him." He viewed his talent as his shield. He thought, "I am funny. I am a professional. My work speaks for itself." He failed to understand that to the studio system, he was not a person. He was a unit of production. He was a depreciating asset with a liability attached. Tom didn't understand that corporate Hollywood doesn't have a heart to break. It only has a bottom line to protect. He was walking into a buzzsaw with a bouquet of flowers. Before the official coming out interview on television, there was a period in 1993 of agonizing limbo. Tom was still trying to work. He was still showing up to auditions, but he wasn't hiding the lesions as effectively as he should have. This period was perhaps more painful than the total exile that followed. It was the era of the gaze. When Tom walked into a casting office, the temperature in the room would drop. Casting directors, people he had known for a decade, would greet him with tight, forced smiles. They would shake his hand, but quickly. Then their eyes would drift. Despite their best efforts to be polite, their gaze would inevitably lock onto the purple marks on his nose. You could see the mental calculus happening behind their eyes. Is that it? Does he have it? If we cast him, will he be alive when the movie comes out? What will the insurance company say? Tom would perform. He would be funny. He would be the old Tom. But the laughter in the room was brittle. The air was thick with the unspoken. He would leave the audition thinking he nailed it, thinking his spirit had shone through. But the moment the door clicked shut, his resume was likely dropped into the trash can. It wasn't just the executives, it was the crew. On the few guest spots he managed to book during this transitional phase, the atmosphere was paranoid. The 1990s were rife with misinformation. People thought you could get AIDS from a toilet seat, from a shared fork, from a sneeze. When Tom Villard reached for a donut at the craft services table, he would feel the eyes on him. He would see people subtly stepping back. He became a ghost in the machine, present but dreaded. While the social rejection was painful, the administrative rejection was lethal. This is where the naive hope of Tom Villard crashed into the stone wall of capitalism. Filmmaking is, at its core, a risk management business. Every production is bonded by an insurance company to protect the investor's money. If a key actor dies or becomes too sick to perform during filming, the insurance pays out to reshoot the scenes or scrap the project. By 1993, insurance companies had essentially redlined the entire gay community, and specifically anyone with visible signs of illness. They didn't need a medical report, they just needed a rumor. Tom was marked as uninsurable. In Hollywood, this is a non-status. It doesn't matter if you are the greatest actor of your generation. It doesn't matter if the director loves you. If you cannot be bonded, you cannot be hired. It is a strict binary rule. Producers use this as a shield for their own bigotry. They could claim, "We love Tom. We really wanted him." But the bonding company said no. It washed their hands of the moral responsibility. They could sleep at night telling themselves it was just an administrative hurdle, not a human rights violation. Tom, in his optimism, tried to fight this with logic. He would argue, "I am not dying today. I can work this week. I can sign a waiver." But the system was not interested in nuance. It was interested in zero risk. By the winter of 1994, Tom Villard was no longer fighting for his career. He was fighting for his narrative. The previous 2 years, 1992 and 1993, had been a slow-motion car crash of whispers, sidelong glances, and unreturned phone calls. The industry knew something was wrong, but because Tom hadn't said the words, the industry was paralyzed by its own polite cowardice. They simply stopped hiring him, leaving him in a purgatory of ambiguity. Tom, sitting in his home in the Hollywood Hills, watched his savings dwindle and his body weaken. He realized that the strategy of dignified silence was failing. Silence looked like guilt. Silence looked like shame. And Tom Villard, despite the lesions on his face and the virus in his blood, refused to be ashamed. He decided to throw a Hail Mary. In American football, a Hail Mary is a desperate, long-range pass thrown into the end zone in the final seconds of a losing game, hoping for a miracle catch. Tom's Hail Mary was national television. He booked an interview with Entertainment Tonight, the media landscape of 1994. There was no social media. There was no Twitter to control your own story. Entertainment Tonight was the apex predator of celebrity news. It was the show that everyone in the industry watched. Agents watched it. Casting directors watched it. Studio heads watched it while eating dinner. Tom's logic was heartbreakingly simple, and as we have established, fatally naive. He believed that if he went on the biggest platform available and looked the camera in the eye, he could humanize the disease. He believed he could say, "Look, it's me. It's the guy who made you laugh in My Girl. I have this illness, but I am still me. I am still capable. I am still employable." He thought he was launching a comeback. In reality, he was scheduling his own eulogy, February 1994. The atmosphere in the Entertainment Tonight studio was thick with a specific kind of tension. Production assistants whispered in corners. The makeup artists were likely nervous, handling their brushes with the trepidation that defined the era's ignorance about HIV transmission. Tom Villard sat in the chair. He looked different. The boyish roundness of his face, the quality that had made him so non-threatening for 15 years, had evaporated. His features were sharper, gaunter, and there, undeniable and stark against his pale skin, were the Kaposi's sarcoma lesions. Most publicists would have screamed for heavy concealer. They would have demanded lighting that washed out the imperfections. Tom refused. This was the core of his fatal innocence. He genuinely believed that the truth was his armor. He didn't want to trick the audience into thinking he was healthy. He wanted to convince them that his sickness didn't matter. He wanted to redefine what an actor looked like. When the cameras rolled, Tom did not weep. He did not beg for sympathy. He was remarkably composed. He channeled that same earnest, slightly manic energy that had served him so well in sitcoms, but now it was grounded in a terrifying reality. The interviewer asked the hard questions, but Tom's answers were harder. He spoke about the lesions. He pointed to them. "I have nothing to hide," he said in substance, if not exact phrasing. "I am living with AIDS. I am not a victim. I am fighting." He spoke about the red ribbon. This was the moment that should have been iconic. He gestured to the marks on his face, the marks that had made him a pariah, and claimed them as badges of honor. He was trying to flip the script. He was telling Hollywood, "You wear red ribbons on your Versace tuxedos once a year to feel good about yourselves. I wear mine on my skin every single day. If you support the cause, you must support me." It was a brilliant, searing moral argument. It was also a professional suicide note. Tom's fatal error was assuming that Hollywood operated on a moral axis. He assumed that the producers watching at home would be moved by his bravery. He thought they would slap their knees and say, "Oh, damn, that kid has guts. Let's get him a script." He didn't understand what the producers actually saw. They didn't see a hero. They saw a liability. When Tom looked into the camera and said, "I want to work," the industry heard, "I am a high-risk investment who might die before principal photography is finished." When Tom showed his lesions, the industry didn't see courage. They saw a continuity nightmare. How are we going to light that? How much will digital removal cost? What if the audience is grossed out? The interview aired. Millions watched. For a brief moment, Tom Villard was the most talked about man in Hollywood. The initial public reaction was a mix of shock and morbid curiosity. Fans sent letters. The sheer audacity of a B-list sitcom star coming out as dying of AIDS on primetime TV was unprecedented. Tom went home to his partner, Scott, and waited for the phone to ring. He likely expected a mix of calls, some supportive, some business-related. He expected the family of show business to rally. The phone did not ring. Or rather, the right phones did not ring. The agents with job offers? Silent. The directors he had worked with? Silent. The producers who had made millions off his comedic timing? Silent. Instead of a comeback, the Entertainment Tonight interview functioned as a final confirmation of his unemployability. Before the interview, he was rumored to be sick, which meant a brave producer could perhaps still take a risk. After the interview, he was confirmed to be sick. The insurance companies now had video evidence to deny his bonding. Tom had handed them the weapon to finish him off. The weeks following the broadcast were arguably the darkest of Tom's life, psychologically speaking. This was the moment the innocence shattered. Tom had played by the rules. He had been a good citizen. He had been honest. And he realized with a crushing finality that honesty was a currency that had no value in Los Angeles. He began to realize that he wasn't just unemployed. He was untouchable. The stigma was so potent that even being seen with him was considered a risk for other actors. If you were an up-and-coming star, hanging out with Tom Villard was a signal that you too might be one of them. You too might be difficult. Tom had believed that his body of work, his 15 years of reliable service, would be his safety net. He found out that in Hollywood, you are only as good as your last hit, and you are only as valuable as your future potential. Tom Villard, with a T-cell count dropping and lesions on his face, had zero future potential in the eyes of the studio system. To contextualize the unfairness of this moment, we must look at the other major HIV story of the early 90s, Magic Johnson. Magic Johnson announced his HIV status in 1991. He was embraced. He was a hero. He was allowed to retire with dignity and later even return to play. But Magic was a heterosexual sports icon. He fit the mold of the masculine conqueror. Tom Villard was a gay character actor known for playing soft men. He did not have the armor of hypermasculinity to protect him. Magic Johnson was a tragedy to be mourned. Tom Villard was a statistic to be ignored. Tom saw this disparity. He saw how the red carpets were rolled out for some, while the back doors were bolted shut for him. By the spring of 1994, the adrenaline of the Entertainment Tonight appearance had worn off, replaced by a cold, hard reality. The Hail Mary had been intercepted. Tom was no longer an actor. The identity he had curated since he was a teenager in New York, the identity of the craftsman, the performer, the professional, was stripped away. He was now just a patient. This loss of identity accelerated his physical decline. Psychoneuroimmunology is the study of how the mind affects the immune system. It is well documented that stress, depression, and loss of purpose can ravage the immune response. Tom Villard was stripped of his purpose. He was a comedian with no audience. He was a worker with no trade. The virus, sensing the weakness in the host's spirit, began to advance with terrifying speed. The lesions spread. The weight dropped off. The energy that had once powered We Got It Made and My Girl flickered and dimmed. He had spent his savings trying to stay camera ready for a call that never came. Now, the money was gone. The rich Hollywood star was facing the end of his life with empty pockets. As 1994 marched toward summer, Tom Villard retreated. He stopped looking for the spotlight because the spotlight had burned him. He retreated into the only safe harbor he had left, the small, private world he shared with Scott Chambliss. The doors of the industry were locked. The family had changed the locks. Tom was on the outside, looking in at the party he used to entertain, realizing that he was never truly a guest. He was just the hired help, and the help was no longer needed. The morning after the Entertainment Tonight interview aired, Tom Villard woke up in his home in the Hollywood Hills and waited for the world to change. He had done the hardest thing a man in his position could do. He had looked into the lens of a camera, stripped away the makeup, pointed to the purple lesions on his face, and told the truth. In the narrative movie playing in his head, the one where honesty is rewarded and courage is currency, this was the start of the third act. This was the redemption arc. He expected the phone to ring. He didn't expect a ticker tape parade, perhaps, but he expected acknowledgement. A call from a producer saying, "That was brave, Tom. Let's talk." A note from a director saying, "We can work around this." He waited for the industry, his family of 15 years, to reach out a hand. The phone did not ring. The fax machine remained silent. The mailbox at the end of the driveway was empty. The silence that descended on Tom Villard's life in the spring of 1994 was not peaceful. It was heavy. It was a silence that had mass and weight. It was the sound of a door being gently but firmly locked from the outside. Tom had anticipated a battle. He was ready to fight bigotry. He was ready to debate producers. But Hollywood didn't offer him a fight. It offered him a void. He was prepared to be shouted at. He was not prepared to be ghosted. In the weeks following his disclosure, Tom tried to get back to work. He called his agents. He called the casting directors who had booked him for My Girl just 3 years prior. The response was a masterclass in Californian politeness. No one said, "We don't hire people with AIDS." That would be illegal. That would be rude. Instead, they used the soft no. "Tom, we love you," they would say, their voices dripping with synthetic sympathy. "But the project is on hold. We're going in a different direction. The schedule is just too grueling. We don't want to overwork you." It was gaslighting on an industrial scale. They framed his unemployment as an act of mercy. They were protecting him. By refusing to hire him, they claimed they were looking out for his health. Tom knew the truth, of course. He knew that protecting his health was code for protecting their investment. Then came the ultimate weapon, the one that ended the conversation before it even began, the completion bond. The completion bond is the unsexy, bureaucratic heartbeat of Hollywood. It is the insurance policy that guarantees a film will be finished. If an actor dies mid-shoot, the bond pays out. In 1994, the insurance companies simply drew a red line through the name of any actor known to be HIV positive. It was the perfect alibi for the studios. Producers could shrug their shoulders and look Tom in the eye, or rather, look just past his eye to avoid seeing the lesions and say, "It's not us, Tom. It's the insurance guys. You know how they are. Our hands are tied." This was the mechanism of erasure. It wasn't a villain twirling a mustache. It was an actuary in a back office in Hartford, Connecticut, looking at a mortality table and stamping "declined" on a file. It was a banal administrative murder of a career. On the rare, miraculous occasions where Tom did manage to secure a small role, perhaps a voiceover or a day player part on a show that was self-insured, he walked onto the set not as a star, but as a contagion. The atmosphere on a film set is usually tactile. People touch. Makeup artists touch your face. Costumers adjust your collar. Sound guys tape microphones to your chest. It is a world of physical intimacy. When Tom walked onto a set in 1994, the Red Sea parted. He could feel the recoil. He would sit in the makeup chair, and he could sense the artist holding their breath. He watched them double glove, the snap of the latex sounding like a gavel banging in a courtroom. He saw the way they disposed of the sponges he had touched, dropping them into biohazard bags as if he were radioactive. There is a story whispered among those who were there of a craft services table. Tom, hungry and trying to maintain a sense of normalcy, went to grab a coffee and a donut. As he approached, the chatter stopped. A crew member, seeing Tom reach for the tongs, suddenly decided he wasn't hungry anymore and walked away. Tom stood there, holding a paper cup, surrounded by 50 people, and he was the loneliest man on earth. He realized then that the red ribbon he wore on his face wasn't a badge of honor to these people. It was a warning sign. Danger. Keep away. He wasn't Tom Villard, the funny guy from We Got It Made. He was a walking reminder of death. And in a town built on the fantasy of eternal youth, death is the ultimate party foul. If the professional rejection was cold business, the social rejection was a heartbreak. Tom had always been social. He was the guy you invited to the party because he made everyone laugh. But as the lesion spread and the weight dropped off his frame, the invitation stopped. It wasn't just that people were afraid of the virus, though many were, fueled by the ignorance of the time. It was that people were afraid of the awkwardness. They didn't know what to say to him. Did they ask how he was? That seemed morbid. Did they pretend nothing was wrong? That seemed insane. So, to avoid the discomfort of a difficult conversation, they simply avoided the person. Tom would run into old friends at the grocery store, actors he had shared scenes with, producers he had dined with. He would see the panic in their eyes. He would see them check their watches. "Oh, Tom, God, it's been ages. We must do lunch," they would say, already backing away, their feet pointing towards the exit. "We must do lunch" is the Hollywood translation for goodbye forever. Tom would go home to Scott, his partner, and recount these meetings. He wasn't angry. He was bewildered. He couldn't understand how relationships built over a decade could evaporate in 10 seconds. He was learning the hardest lesson of Los Angeles. Friendship is often just another form of networking. When you are no longer useful, you are no longer a friend. While the emotional toll was devastating, the financial reality was catastrophic. The mechanism of erasure didn't just take his pride, it took his livelihood. Tom had made good money in the 80s, but the cost of being sick in America is astronomical. In 1994, there were no generic drugs for HIV. The medications were experimental, toxic, and exorbitantly priced. Tom was burning through his savings at a terrifying rate. The mortgage on the house in the hills, the symbol of his success, became a millstone around his neck. The residuals from his old shows were shrinking. There is a perverse irony here. At the exact moment Tom was going broke paying for medical care, Hollywood was patting itself on the back for producing Philadelphia. The industry was winning Oscars for telling a fictional story about an AIDS patient fighting discrimination, while simultaneously discriminating against a real actor dying in their own zip code. Tom watched this hypocrisy from his living room. He saw the red ribbons at the award shows. He saw the tearful speeches. And then he looked at his pile of unpaid bills. The disconnect was enough to drive a man insane. He realized he was the wrong kind of victim. He wasn't a noble, tragic figure in a movie. He was a messy, inconvenient reality. By the late summer of 1994, the erasure was nearly complete. Tom stopped going out. The effort required to put on a brave face, to ignore the stares, to pretend he didn't hear the whispers, was too much for his failing body. He retreated into the house. The world shrank to the size of his bedroom. The mechanism of erasure had worked perfectly. Hollywood had effectively deleted Tom Villard. He was no longer an actor. He was no longer a celebrity. He was just a sick man in a dark room, cared for by the only person who hadn't run away, Scott. But even in this darkness, Tom's spirit flickered with a stubborn, tragic light. He refused to believe it was over. He kept his SAG card in his wallet. He kept his headshots in the drawer. He held on to the belief that if he could just get better, if he could just find a new drug, if the lesions would just fade, they would take him back. It was the lie that kept him alive, and the lie that broke his heart every single day. Hollywood had not killed him. The virus was doing that. But Hollywood had buried him while he was still breathing. They had thrown the dirt of indifference over his career, tamped it down with an insurance stamp, and walked away without looking back. The autumn of 1994 in Los Angeles was unseasonably warm. The Santa Ana winds were blowing, those hot, dry desert gusts that writers like Raymond Chandler famously described as making people meek and little and afraid. For Tom Villard, trapped within the walls of his home in the Hollywood Hills, the weather was irrelevant. His world had shrunk from the sound stages of Burbank and the red carpets of Westwood to the confines of a master bedroom. He was 40 years old. By all rights, he should have been entering his prime. This is the age where character actors often find their stride, transitioning from the goofy sidekick to the respected veteran. Instead, Tom was transitioning into a memory. The mechanism of erasure detailed in the previous chapter had done its work. The phone had stopped ringing. The industry had moved on. Now the battle was no longer about career or legacy. It was a primal, terrifying struggle for breath. To understand the end of Tom Villard's life, we must step inside the sanctuary he shared with Scott Chambliss. It was a house filled with art, with books, with the remnants of a life well lived. But in those final months, the house transformed. It became a hospice. The master bedroom, once a place of rest, became a medical ward. The nightstand, previously cluttered with scripts and alarm clocks, was now crowded with pill bottles, AZT, D4T, antibiotics, antifungal creams, a chemical arsenal that was fighting a losing war. Tom's body, the instrument he had tuned so perfectly at the Lee Strasberg Institute, was betraying him in slow motion. The virus was systematic. It stripped the fat from his limbs, leaving him skeletal. It stole his energy, making a trip to the bathroom feel like a marathon. It clouded his mind. The sharp wit that had defined his comedy occasionally lost in a fog of fever and medication. But the cruelest thief was the mirror. The lesions, the red ribbons he had tried to wear with pride, had spread. They were no longer just a political statement. They were a source of physical agony. Scott Chambliss became the gatekeeper, the nurse, and the anchor. In a world that had abandoned Tom, Scott was the only constant. He washed the sheets soaked in night sweats. He crushed the pills when Tom could no longer swallow them whole. He sat by the bed for hours, holding a hand that was becoming frighteningly frail, reading aloud to a man who could no longer hold a book. This was a love story that Hollywood never saw. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't cinema. It was the raw, exhausting, beautiful reality of in sickness and in health. As the physical darkness closed in, so did the financial reality. It is a detail often left out of celebrity biographies, but it is essential here. Tom Villard died broke. The healthcare system in America is a machine designed to extract wealth from the desperate. And in 1994, HIV care was a luxury product. The thousands of dollars Tom had saved from his sitcom days were incinerated by hospital stays and experimental treatments. There were days of genuine panic about money. The mortgage was a constant specter. The irony was bitter. Reruns of The Golden Girls and My Girl were playing on televisions all over the world, generating profits for the studios, while the man on the screen lay in bed worrying about the electric bill. Friends, the few who remained, quietly chipped in. They brought food. They helped with errands. But the Hollywood community, the entity that claims to take care of its own, was absent. There were no fundraisers for Tom. There were no telethons. He was allowed to slip through the cracks because he was the wrong kind of sick. He was a reminder of the terror everyone else was trying to ignore. By November 1994, it was clear the end was near. The pneumonia, pneumocystis carinii pneumonia, the notorious killer of AIDS patients, had settled in his lungs. Every breath was a battle. It was the sound of drowning on dry land. Tom was lucid in moments. In these windows of clarity, he didn't talk about his acting. He didn't talk about the roles he lost. He talked about the people he loved. He talked about Scott. There is a profound sadness in realizing that Tom's fatal innocence had finally evaporated. He no longer expected the phone to ring. He no longer thought a producer would save him. He accepted that he had been discarded, but he refused to let that discard define his soul. He was angry. Yes, who wouldn't be? He was angry at the unfairness of it. He was angry that he had played by the rules and been punished for it. But beneath the anger, there was still the gentle spirit of the boy from Rochester. He didn't want revenge. He just wanted to be remembered. On November 14, 1994, just 5 days shy of his 41st birthday, the performance finally ended. Tom Villard did not die on a sound stage, nor in a sterile hospital ward surrounded by machines. He died in the only sanctuary left to him, his bedroom in the Hollywood Hills, in the arms of Scott Chambliss, the man who had been his audience of one when the rest of the world walked out. The obituaries the next day were brief and clinical. Actor, 40, AIDS complications. They stripped away the texture of his struggle, but the industry's indifference could no longer touch him. In the eyes of Hollywood, Tom might have died a fool, a naive man who lost his career because he refused to lie. But looking back, he wasn't the fool. He was the only sane man in an asylum. He had refused to cover the lesions on his face to make healthy people feel comfortable. He had committed the one unforgivable sin in Tinseltown. He dropped the mask. Tom Villard died broke, blacklisted, and exhausted, but he died with a clean soul. In the final scene of his life, he didn't get the standing ovation he deserved. but he possessed the truth, and in the end, that is the only credit that matters.